October 1944. The city of Aachen, Germany. Not the city as it had been. The department stores on Adalbertsteinweg, the cathedral where Charlemagne was crowned, the tram lines and the bakeries and the apartment blocks where 300,000 people had lived their ordinary lives, all of it reduced, block by block, to a geometry of rubble and broken wall. Dust hung in the air like smoke that had forgotten how to rise. The streets smelled of wet plaster and something older, something the men who fought there would spend the rest of their lives trying to forget. A German sniper, call him by his rank Obergefreiter, a senior lance corporal in what remained of the 246th Volksgrenadier Division, was positioned in the upper floor of a gutted building on Wilhelmstrasse. He had a clear line of sight to the street below. He had been there since before dawn. He had a Karabiner 98K with a 4-power Zeiss optic, and he was very good at his job. He had killed 3 men that morning. And then, through his scope, he watched an American medic, a young man with a red cross on his helmet and another on his armband, sprint across an open intersection to reach a wounded soldier. The medic dropped to his knees. He worked. He did not look up. The sniper did not fire. He would not fire. Stop and think about that. A trained German marksman, in the middle of street-to-street urban combat, with a clear shot at an enemy soldier, chose not to take it. Not because he couldn't. Not because he was ordered to stand down. Not because he was afraid. He chose not to. And he was not alone. Across the rubble of Aachen, in the worst urban fighting American forces had experienced since they crossed into Germany, this pattern repeated itself so consistently that American medics noticed it, documented it, and talked about it for decades afterward. This is not a story about the Geneva Convention. It is not a story about German chivalry or American propaganda. What actually happened in Aachen in October of 1944, between snipers and medics, between men who were trying to kill each other and men who were trying to save lives, is more complicated, more human, and more instructive than any of those framings. To understand it, we need to go back, not just to the war, further back than that, back to the document that created the world those men were fighting in. Part 1. The Paper That Changed Killing. 1864. Geneva, Switzerland. A city that had seen nothing like it. 26 nations sent delegates to a conference convened at the invitation of a Swiss businessman named Jean-Henri Dunant. Dunant was 36 years old, a Protestant from a prosperous Geneva family, and he had, 6 years earlier, witnessed something that had broken something inside him. At the Battle of Solferino in 1859, a single day of fighting between French Piedmontese and Austrian forces in northern Italy, roughly 40,000 men were killed or wounded. Dunant arrived the following day on a business errand and found himself instead in the middle of what he described in his memoir as a human slaughterhouse. He spent 3 days organizing local women to care for the wounded, improvising, and he never stopped thinking about it afterward. His memoir, A Memory of Solferino, published in 1862, contained a question that had no good answer. Why did no permanent organization exist to care for wounded soldiers on both sides of any conflict? The Geneva Convention of 1864 was the beginning of an answer. 16 nations signed it on the 22nd of August. It established, for the first time in the history of organized warfare, a set of rules. Wounded soldiers would be cared for regardless of which side they fought on. Medical personnel would be protected. Buildings used as hospitals would be protected. And all of this would be signified by a single symbol. A red cross on a white field, the inverse of the Swiss flag, chosen as a tribute to Dunant's country. Hold that symbol in your mind for a moment. The convention did not invent mercy. Men had always sometimes spared the wounded, sometimes cared for enemy soldiers, sometimes extended informal courtesies across the lines of battle. What the convention did was something more radical. It attempted to codify those courtesies into binding international law, to take the informal and make it formal, to take the situational and make it universal. It was an act of enormous optimism. It assumed that even men in the middle of killing each other could be made to observe rules, not because they were saints, but because the rules served everyone's interest. That assumption would be tested in every subsequent conflict. The convention was revised in 1868, again in 1906, again in 1929. Each revision added detail, closed loopholes, extended protections. By 1929, the Geneva Convention on the Treatment of Prisoners of War and the Convention for the Amelioration of the Condition of the Wounded and Sick in Armies in the Field were both in force, signed and ratified by most of the major powers, including Germany. The rules were clear. Medical personnel bearing the Red Cross emblem were non-combatants. They were not to be fired upon. They were not to be taken prisoner. They were to be allowed to do their work. The Germans had signed this. The Americans had signed this. Both armies entered the Second World War with explicit training on these obligations. But here is the thing that the convention, for all its detail, could not fully address: the difference between a rule written in a conference room in Geneva and a rule observed by a 22-year-old with a rifle in the rubble of a German city. Rules written in peacetime have to survive contact with war. They have to survive fear, exhaustion, hatred, grief, and the specific, grinding brutality of urban combat, a form of fighting so close, so personal, and so psychologically corrosive that it tends to strip away everything except the most immediate calculus of survival. The question of whether German snipers in Aachen observed the Geneva Convention protections for American medics is not a question about international law. It is a question about what happens to rules and to people under the most extreme possible pressure. And the answer, it turns out, is not simple. Part 2. The Anatomy of Aachen. To understand what happened on those streets, you have to understand what Aachen was and what it was becoming. Aachen was the westernmost major German city. It sat less than 5 kilometers from the Belgian and Dutch borders, in a shallow basin surrounded by low hills. It had been a Roman spa town, a Carolingian capital, the coronation site of 30 German kings over 6 centuries. Its cathedral, the Palatine Chapel, built on the orders of Charlemagne around 800, was one of the oldest surviving buildings in Northern Europe. The city had a population of approximately 165,000 people as of 1939. By the time American forces surrounded it in early October of 1944, most of those people had been evacuated or had fled. The ones who remained, several thousand civilians, estimates vary, were the old, the sick, the stubborn, and those with nowhere else to go. The American forces tasked with taking the city were from the 1st Infantry Division, the Big Red One, and the 30th Infantry Division. The 1st Infantry Division had been in combat since the North Africa landings in November of 1942. By October of 1944, its veterans were men who had survived Tunisia, Sicily, Normandy, and the breakout across France. They were not idealists. They were not naive. They were, by any measure, among the most experienced combat infantry in the American Army. Meet Staff Sergeant Joseph T. Dawson, 29 years old, born in Waco, Texas, schoolteacher before the war. He had led his company onto Omaha Beach on the 6th of June, 1944, and had been one of the first Americans to breach the German defenses at the bluffs above the beach. He won the Distinguished Service Cross for that. By October, he was commanding G Company, 2nd Battalion, 16th Infantry Regiment, 1st Infantry Division, and he was walking into Aachen. Dawson would later describe the fighting in Aachen as unlike anything he had experienced before. In Normandy, he said in a post-war interview, you had distance, you had fields, you could see where the fire was coming from most of the time. In Aachen, you were fighting for individual rooms, individual staircases. You'd clear a floor and then get shot from the floor above through the ceiling. The German forces defending the city were the 246th Volksgrenadier Division, supplemented by elements of the 49th Infantry Division and various police, SS, and Volkssturm units. The 246th was not a first-line formation. It had been rebuilt after heavy losses on the Eastern Front and was manned largely by older soldiers, recovered wounded, and men transferred from other branches of service. Its commander, Oberst Gerhard Wilk, was a competent professional who understood perfectly well that he was defending an indefensible position. His orders from Hitler were to hold Aachen to the last man. He had roughly 5,000 men with which to attempt this. The Americans began their assault on the city on the 13th of October, 1944. What followed was 19 days of combat in which every building became a fortress, every street became a kill zone, and every man's survival depended on reading the environment around him with absolute precision. Here is what urban combat at this scale does to a sniper's calculus. A sniper in an open field, or even in a forest, operates with a degree of remove. His targets are at distance. His engagement decisions happen in fractions of seconds, but there is at least some spatial separation between him and what he is shooting at. In a city like Aachen in October of 1944, where the fighting was often at ranges of less than 50 meters, sometimes less than 20, that remove vanishes. The sniper could see the faces of the men he was watching. He could see their expressions. He could see who they were. And he could see, with absolute clarity, what a medic was doing. The American medics of the 1st Infantry Division wore the standard Red Cross identification, a brassard on the left arm, a helmet marked with a red cross on white. They carried no weapons, or were supposed to carry no weapons, though in the brutal pragmatism of close combat, some carried pistols for self-defense. They ran toward wounded men. They knelt beside them. They were, in the visual grammar of a battlefield, doing something that was categorically different from what everyone else was doing. And this visibility mattered. Hold that detail, because there is a fundamental tension in how urban combat treats the Geneva Convention protections, and it runs through everything that happened in Aachen. The rules say medical personnel are protected. The rules say you identify them with a red cross. But in a war where every building is fortified, where every window is a potential gun port, where the enemy will use any advantage available, the Red Cross also makes you a target. It tells the enemy exactly where the casualties are. It tells them that the men around the medic are likely wounded, disoriented, in pain. In a different kind of war, with different rules of engagement, the medic would be the most valuable target on the field. The Germans in Aachen did not treat him that way. The question is why? Part 3. The testimony and the pattern. The evidence comes from several sources, none of them comprehensive, all of them convergent. The most direct documentation comes from the after-action reports and personal accounts of American medical personnel who served in Aachen. The 16th Infantry Regiment's regimental history, compiled in the months after the battle, contains several references to the behavior of German snipers toward medics. The 1st Infantry Division's Medical Battalion, the 1st Medical Battalion, kept records of casualties among its personnel. Those records are instructive. During the 19 days of fighting in Aachen, the 1st Medical Battalion suffered casualties. Men were wounded, some were killed, but the casualty rate among medics was notably lower than the casualty rate among the infantry they served. And several medical personnel, in interviews conducted both immediately after the battle and in the decades following, specifically noted that they had been in exposed positions, clearly marked, and had not been fired upon by German snipers. Technician, 5th grade Harold Garman, 23 years old, from Albion, Illinois, who had worked as a farmhand before the war and was now serving as a combat medic with the 1st Infantry Division, gave an account that became something of a reference point. In a unit history interview conducted in the spring of 1945, Garman described running across an open street under fire to reach a wounded soldier. He was wearing his Red Cross brassard. He was clearly visible. German fire continued around him, at other targets, but he was not hit. He reached the wounded man, applied a tourniquet, and got him back to cover. He said he had done this multiple times during the Aachen fighting and had come to believe, with some confidence, that the German snipers were deliberately not targeting him. "I don't know if it was the Geneva Convention or just the way they were," Garman said, "but they let us work." Hold that phrase. They let us work. Now, a historian has to be careful here. Survivorship bias is real. The medics who were killed by snipers in Aachen cannot give testimony. The pattern Garman and others describe may be partly a function of who survived to report it. And there were, without question, instances in the broader European campaign where German forces did target medics. Documented cases of Red Cross markings being ignored, of ambulances being fired upon, of medical personnel being killed in circumstances that strongly suggest deliberate targeting. Aachen was not the whole war, and the whole war was not Aachen. But the convergence of testimony from Aachen specifically is striking enough to take seriously. Multiple accounts, from multiple units, from men who had no reason to coordinate their stories, all point in the same direction. Something was happening in that city that was different from random chance. Meet Oberst Gerhard Wilk, 50 years old, a career infantry officer from Berlin who had served in the First World War as a teenager and had spent the entire Second World War on the Eastern Front before being assigned to command the Aachen garrison in September of 1944. Wilk was a professional soldier of the old school, a man who had been trained in a military culture that took the laws of war seriously, not as idealism, but as practical necessity. He understood that armies which violated the laws of war created reciprocal environments in which their own wounded would not be cared for. Wilk surrendered Aachen on the 21st of October 1944, after his position became militarily untenable. He was the first German general to surrender a German city to Allied forces. In captivity, he was interviewed extensively by American intelligence officers. His comments on the conduct of his troops during the battle include several references to the treatment of American medical personnel. Wilk stated, according to the American intelligence summary of his debriefing, that his orders to his men had included explicit instructions to observe Geneva Convention protections for medical personnel. He said this was not merely a matter of following orders. He said it was a matter of military culture. This is the key detail. Sit with it for a moment. Wilk was not claiming that his men were particularly compassionate. He was not claiming that they liked Americans. He was claiming that the decision to spare medics was embedded in how German professional soldiers thought about warfare, that it was, in his words, how soldiers behave. That phrase, how soldiers behave, contains an entire philosophy of war. It is the residue of a tradition that runs back through the Hague Conventions, through the Geneva Convention, through the customs of European warfare that had developed over centuries. It is the idea that there are things soldiers do and things soldiers do not do. Not because they are ordered to, not because they are afraid of punishment, but because those rules are part of what it means to be a soldier rather than simply a killer. Part 4. The verdict. Here is the forensic verdict of this investigation. What happened in Aachen in October of 1944 was not a single phenomenon. It was the intersection of at least 4 distinct forces, each of which contributed to the pattern that American medics observed and documented. Understanding those forces separately is the only way to understand what they produced together. The first force was institutional training. The German army, the Wehrmacht, trained its soldiers in the laws of war as a matter of standard doctrine. The Geneva Convention protections for medical personnel were not abstract theory in Wehrmacht training manuals. They were specific, practical instructions. Soldiers were told what the Red Cross insignia meant. They were told that medical personnel were non-combatants. They were told not to fire on them. This training was consistent and repeated. By the time a German soldier arrived in Aachen in October of 1944, he had heard these rules many times. Training does not guarantee compliance, but it creates a default. In the absence of specific orders to the contrary, in the absence of a direct and immediate threat, a trained soldier tends to fall back on what he has been taught. The default behavior for a German sniper in Aachen when he had a medic in his sights was, "Do not fire." The second force was reciprocity. This is perhaps the least sentimental explanation, and in some ways the most honest. German soldiers in Aachen were fighting a losing battle. They knew by October of 1944 that Germany was losing the war. They knew that many of them would become casualties, either killed or, increasingly likely, captured. The men who would care for them if they were wounded were German medics, also marked with red crosses. The men who would care for them if they were captured were American medics. Shooting American medics was not just a violation of the laws of war. It was a direct threat to their own survival. A German soldier who shot an American medic was, in the most direct possible sense, contributing to a world in which his own medics would be shot. The reciprocity calculation was not abstract, it was immediate and personal. Wilk understood this. His men understood this. The decision to spare American medics was, at least in part, a rational calculation about what kind of war they wanted to fight and what kind of treatment they wanted to receive. The third force was the specific character of urban combat. This sounds counterintuitive, but stay with it. Urban combat is the most psychologically intense form of warfare. It is also, paradoxically, the form of warfare in which individual human beings become most visible to each other. In a field battle, the enemy is a distant figure, an abstraction, a shape moving at the edge of your vision. In Aachen, the enemy was a man you could see clearly, sometimes close enough to hear breathing. This visibility cuts both ways. It makes killing more personal, more brutal, more psychologically costly. But it also makes the categories of the battlefield more legible. The medic was not an abstraction. He was a man with a red cross on his helmet, kneeling next to a wounded soldier, doing something that was visually unmistakable. In the compressed, hyper-visible world of urban combat, the medic's identity was clearer than it would have been at distance. And clarity, it turns out, matters. The fourth force was the specific culture of the units involved. The 246th Volksgrenadier Division was not an SS formation. It was not a unit with a documented history of atrocity. It was a conventional infantry division manned largely by older soldiers who had grown up in a military culture that, whatever else it had become under National Socialism, retained certain professional norms about the treatment of non-combatants. The men defending Aachen were not, by and large, ideological fanatics. They were exhausted professionals who understood that they were losing and who, in the specific context of this specific battle, chose to fight in a particular way. This matters because it prevents us from generalizing in either direction. The pattern in Aachen does not mean that all German soldiers in all situations respected Geneva Convention protections. They did not. The Eastern Front was a different world, operating under different rules, producing different behaviors. The SS formations that operated throughout the war committed documented atrocities against prisoners, wounded soldiers, and medical personnel. The same German army that produced Gerhard Wilck produced the men who carried out the Malmedy massacre 6 weeks after Aachen fell. And the pattern in Aachen does not mean that American forces were universally protected by their Red Cross markings throughout the campaign. They were not. The war was too large, too various, too human for any simple rule to hold everywhere. What the pattern in Aachen tells us is something more specific and more interesting. That under the right conditions, the right institutional training, the right reciprocal incentives, the right visibility, the right unit culture, the rules written in a conference room in Geneva in 1864 could survive contact with the worst urban fighting of the Western European campaign. That is not a small thing. Now look at what happened to the men involved. Harold Garman survived the war. He returned to Albion, Illinois, resumed farming, and lived until 1993, dying at 72 years old. He was, by multiple accounts, a quiet man who did not talk much about the war. When he did, he talked about the medics. Joseph Dawson survived Aachen and the rest of the European campaign. He returned to Texas, eventually becoming a businessman. He gave interviews about the war throughout the 1970s and 80s and was consistently one of the most thoughtful and unsentimental voices among 1st Infantry Division veterans. He died in 2002 at the age of 87. Gerhard Wilck spent the remainder of the war in American captivity. He was repatriated to Germany in 1947. He died in 1976 at the age of 82 in West Germany. He had lived long enough to see the country he had fought for rebuilt, divided, partially reconciled, and to see the military culture he had inherited and partly embodied, debated and re-examined, and, in some respects, transformed. Jean-Henri Dunant, whose grief at Solferino had started all of this, died in 1910 at the age of 82 in a small Swiss village called Heiden, where he had spent the last years of his life in a hospice. He died in the bed where he had slept for 18 years, having given away everything he owned to support his humanitarian work. He received the first Nobel Peace Prize in 1901. He is buried in Zurich. The Red Cross on white is still the most recognized humanitarian symbol in the world. And the Obergefreiter in the window on Wilhelmstrasse, the man who watched an American medic sprint across a street and chose not to fire? He is unknown. He left no record. He may have survived the battle, or he may not. He may have been taken prisoner on the 21st of October when Wilck surrendered, or he may have been killed in the days before. He made one decision, in one moment, in one ruined building in one German city, a decision that no one ordered him to make and no one would have known if he had made differently. And he made it anyway. Think about what that means. The laws of war are not self-enforcing. They are not enforced by fear alone, or by training alone, or by rational calculation alone. They survive, when they survive, because individual human beings, in individual moments of choice, decide to observe them. The Obergefreiter on Wilhelmstrasse did not spare that medic because of the Geneva Convention. He spared him because of something that the Geneva Convention, at its best, had tried to cultivate for 80 years. The idea that there are things soldiers do not do. They let us work, Harold Garman said. 3 words. The whole weight of the convention in 3 words. Not the legal text, not the diplomatic negotiations, not the formal ratifications. Just the daily decision, repeated across 19 days of fighting in a ruined German city, to let a man with a red cross on his helmet kneel down and save a life. That decision was not inevitable. Nothing about it was guaranteed. It required, every single time it was made, a human being choosing, under fire, under fear, under the full weight of everything that urban combat does to the people trapped inside it, to behave as a soldier rather than simply as a killer. The distinction is 80 years old. It was written by a businessman from Geneva who spent 3 days in a field hospital and could not forget what he saw. It was signed by 26 nations who understood, at least in that moment, that the rules of killing matter. In Aachen, in October of 1944, in the rubble of the westernmost German city, with the war already lost and the dying still ongoing, the distinction held. Not everywhere, not always, but in that window, on that street, in that moment. It held. If this investigation gave you something, a clearer picture of how the laws of war actually function at the level of individual human decisions, rather than the level of international treaties, press like. It keeps this kind of history in front of people who want to think about it seriously. And if you want the next chapter, subscribe. These stories are worth knowing. They let us work.